Welcome to another episode of Lawyers for Immigrants with your host, Yifei He, president of the law office of Yifei He, where they are dedicated to helping immigrants and new Americans. In every episode, Yifei interviews attorneys across different practice areas and asks them how they are helping immigrants. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and at www.yifeiheelaw.com. Now here's the host of Lawyers for Immigrants, Yifei He.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Lawyers for Immigrants. My name is Yifei He, where we put the grant in immigrant. We're dedicated to helping immigrants and new Americans by interviewing lawyers across different practice areas exclusive of immigration law. Today, my guest on this show is Dmitriy Shakhnevich, who's a criminal defense lawyer. Dimitry practices in New York City, and he actually had a host of his own podcast back in the day called the Fight Lawyers Podcast. So, Dimitry, welcome to this show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Dimitry, can you please tell us about yourself and your practice?
Sure. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I practice family law and some other forms of civil litigation in New York and New Jersey. I have two offices, one in downtown Manhattan, one in Brooklyn. I have another one in Jersey that I don't often frequent. And I've been doing this for now almost 10 years. So it's been a nice long run. I've helped a lot of people. Most of my clients like me. That's all you can ask for. And I'm going to keep going.
Great. And what area of law do you specialize in?
So, as you know, right, specialize is a weird word in the world of law. I practice in criminal defense. I practice in family and divorce primarily, and I do civil litigation of various forms, business litigation, business disputes, contract litigation, things of that nature.
Okay. Well, the way we know each other is actually I listened to your podcast, The Fight Lawyer, and it was a super interesting podcast because you actually interviewed Bruce Buffer, who's the announcer at the UFC, and you also interviewed fighters, and you asked them about topics ranging from entertainment law and contract law, but you actually do criminal defense when we first met in person. So definitely.
I do various things. I became a paralegal when I was 16. I'm 33 now, so that's 17 years. That's a long time that I've been in this business in various capacities. And I'm a person that likes to do new things and try new things. And the podcast was something that I did that I loved, and I wish I could do again if time permitted. But it's tough to deal with all the editing and all the other things. I loved it. I'd love to do it again. I appreciate that you like it. I know people tell me that they like it. Maybe one day. We'll see.
Right. I mean, if I was charged with a crime, I definitely want someone who's a fighter in my corner. And the name, The Fight Lawyer, just sparks a lot of curiosity. So tell us more.
It's one of those names that can have a double meaning, which I like.
Right. So tell us more about your practice in criminal defense and how it's been going and what got you into criminal defense.
Well, when I was in college, I got a job with the Brooklyn DA's office as an intern. I worked there for some time. I went back to the Brooklyn DA's office in law school. And the Brooklyn DA at the time was a gentleman named Charles Hines, who had been the Brooklyn DA for 30 years, something like that. And I met with him, and he offered me to be an ADA in Brooklyn. And he said, the only thing that could mess you up is if you fail the bar or if I'm unelected. So I passed the bar and I went home, and this is like the dream job for anybody who wants to do criminal law in New York or anywhere really. And I looked at the last time a Brooklyn DA got unelected, and it was 1911. And I thought, you know what, I'm probably in good shape. But it turned out he was unelected. I had to look for a new job. I worked with various criminal defense lawyers, high profile lawyers, and ultimately went out on my own and started to do my own thing in about 2014.
Wow. So from 2014 to now, you've probably handled hundreds of criminal defense cases. Is that right?
Yeah, I've handled investigation matters. I've handled matters, obviously, when my clients have been charged with crimes, federal, state. I've done cases all over New York. I've done cases virtually all over New Jersey. I've done some cases out of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and California. And, it's an interesting field of law, and it's been fun for me. And I'm going to keep going.
Right. So do you mostly practice in state court, or is it more federal for you?
Well, all criminal defense lawyers, particularly private criminal defense lawyers, practice primarily in state court because there are more state cases, right? Federal cases are rare. And so most private lawyers practice in state court, as do I. And the majority of my cases are, I get white collar cases. I get cases with folks of all collars, right? From DWIs to violent crimes to domestic violence, things of all natures.
Right. Do you actually have clients who are immigrants?
Yeah, I was born in Ukraine. I came here when I was 3, and I've lived in South Brooklyn my whole life. I never went away to college. I never went away to law school. I've been here forever. And I will say a large majority of my clients are Russian-speaking immigrants. And when I say that, I mean folks from the former Soviet republics. I'm talking obviously Russia and Ukraine and Uzbekistan and Georgia and Kazakhstan and Lithuania. And, there are 15 of them. So
right.
all over.
No, I have some friends from that area as well, growing up as well in Brooklyn and also in Queens. So
that's right.
But what's the difference between representing someone who's an immigrant in criminal defense versus representing someone who's a citizen?
Well, the main difference. The main difference is the collateral consequences. And I'll say that in my cases, in my criminal cases, nearly all of my cases, nearly all of my clients are more concerned with the collateral consequences of a criminal conviction than they are with the direct consequences, right? And I'm not just talking about immigration. I'm talking about employment. I'm talking about educational. I'm talking about licensing, right? Things of all nature. And so immigration is a big one because if a person's not a citizen, that'll change the entire dynamic of a crime and the way you defend a crime, right? And I'm not an immigration lawyer. I always tell my clients to retain immigration lawyers when they have these kinds of issues. But it does change the landscape of a case for sure.
I see. So in addition to immigration collateral consequences, there's also employment laws. There's also, what other collateral consequences are there besides immigration that clients are especially wary of?
Well, you have, if you work for example, if you're an Uber driver, right, in New York, you have to be licensed. You have to be given permission by the TLC. And if the TLC sees that you are accused of a crime, they may take away your license, right? And, if you are working somewhere that has a morals policy or a morals code of conduct, and you signed a contract of employment, you can be hurt by that. And I've represented teachers and doctors and lawyers, and those issues are problematic, right? Because when you have the licensing process come to bear, I usually get a call from a client several years down the line saying, hey, how did that case close? Because I'm, passing the boards now, and they ask me if I have any criminal convictions. And I say, well, this is what happened. You should be fine. This is what we discussed at the time. And, those are the kinds of issues I encounter virtually daily.
Right. And what do you think makes it so that, someone applies for a job, the job wouldn't even, for the TLC example, wouldn't even accept them to be a taxi driver if they have something accused, not even been convicted of something? Like, why do you think that is?
It's unfortunate. The easy answer is responsibility, right? Nobody wants to carry that burden. And when you have a market, when you have a lot of drivers, right, you don't want somebody on the banner that can carry some sort of negative consequence. And the same applies across the board in all professions.
Right. So what do you do then in terms of, do you change the way you represent people based on potential collateral consequences? Or what's your focus when that happens?
My focus is to make sure my client's informed. That is all I can do. I can tell my client exactly what routes are available to them and what the pros and cons are of each route. And some of them choose one route and some of them choose another, and that's fine. But that's all I can do. I can't make a decision for a client. And as you know, we're governed by rules of ethics that say that the clients are permitted to make certain decisions and the lawyers are permitted to make others. And so I kind of run in line with that.
Okay, I mean, the best case scenario is that they're completely innocent, that the cases get dismissed against them, but that often doesn't happen, right? Because usually when
Well,
you're accused of a crime,
straight dismissal is rare, sure. An instance where a prosecutor comes into the courtroom and says, Your Honor, I can't prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt, we'll move to dismiss. That's rare. That'll happen almost never. It happens to me from time to time, but it's extremely rare. And a client should know that. And, there's sometimes a skewed understanding of how the system works. A client will come into my office and say, I want this dismissed. And I'll tell them, look, I also want it dismissed, but we're operating in the real world. And here's what will happen. Probably, here's what will happen likely, here's what will happen more than likely, less than likely, so on and so forth.
right? I mean, in terms of collateral consequences, the best case scenario is for them to have the case dismissed. So if they don't have the case dismissed, what should they do? Because if there's a conviction, there's going to be consequences.
In all cases, the best case scenario is for them to have the case dismissed, not just in cases with collateral consequences. But depending on the case, you'll have options available to you. Typically, if you're representing somebody in the courts of New York City, and it's somebody who is not deemed for one reason or another particularly severe menace to society, there will be some disposition offered that'll take these things into account. Most prosecutors are reasonable in that regard.
Right. Now, why do you think that is? Why do they give someone less than what they, potentially committed a crime for?
Well, because the job of a prosecutor is to do justice, right? Not to put somebody in jail. And if you have somebody who has lived in the United States, for example, for X amount of time, 10 years, 15 years, and now they have a family here and they have a life here and a job and a house, other things, and they commit some crime that may not be particularly serious, but may carry, as the immigration authorities in this country have designated, severe immigration penalties, prosecutors will take that into account, right? They're not going to nail somebody to the wall unless it's warranted. And sometimes it is, but that's in my experience, at least as it relates to my clients, that's been rare.
Okay, so how do you get rid of these cases? Is it through a process that you get rid of them, or do you just go to court sometimes and it just magically disappears? Or
none of this. Unfortunately, if you know of a case that magically disappears, please send that case to me. No case really magically disappears. But again, first of all, I go to court in virtually every case. But it's about what the client wants, right? You tell the client this is what will happen, and the client, if that client is a capable, competent adult, will make an informed decision. And some clients are fighters, and they'll say, "Look, I don't care if I'm deported. I want my day in court. I want to prove my innocence." And most will say, look, I just want to get rid of this in a quiet manner so that my family's not impacted. And then you try to navigate the waters to get there. But every case is different. Every case is fact specific. And so there is no one size fits all.
Right. I mean, is there times when the prosecutor takes advantage of someone because of immigration collateral consequences? So they would just, over prosecute them so that they can potentially be facing these consequences so that they can get a lesser consequence, like lesser crime that they can plead to? Does that happen in your case?
Does a prosecutor, well, most cases in this city are overcharged. And what I mean by that is prosecutors charge a defendant with everything that's sound in fact and law. And will prosecutors use the fact that somebody has potential immigration consequences against them? Not in my experience. And again, right, in the main, by and large, most prosecutors are fair, reasonable people, just like most people are fair, reasonable people. And sometimes you'll get a prosecutor that's overzealous or rather overzealous and acting improperly, but that's rare. I mean, they're by and large good, hardworking people that don't see a need for that kind
Okay, is that the case across the board, across the U.S.? Because you say you practice in multiple states, or is it better in certain jurisdictions versus other jurisdictions?
Well, I've practiced in several jurisdictions, in most of, as you know, if you're going to practice in a jurisdiction outside of which you're admitted, you have to go through a process. I've gone through that process in one state, I believe. In other states, I've represented New York-based companies who have been involved in some stuff in other states. But I can't say that that question has come up in any of my cases outside of New York or New Jersey.
Okay, so in New York, for example, there's more cases of people charged with collateral immigration consequences than other states. Is that a fair assumption to make?
Well, I don't know. I don't practice anywhere else. I guess that would be a sound assumption because New York is an incredibly diverse place, and you probably have more immigrants here. Though again, I'm not a specialist on immigration or public policy as it relates to these things.
Right. I mean, the only reason I say that is because you said prosecutors are reasonable people. So if New York City is a really diverse population and they want to do justice, wouldn't it make sense for them to be more reasonable towards saying offer immigration better, like collateral consequences, instead of trying to like just get them because they're immigrants?
Yes, on the main, that's what happens, right? On the main, if there's a client with an immigration issue, then you will bring that up to the prosecutor in an effort to try to alleviate that issue somehow, for sure. And most will comply within reason, right? They're not gonna they're not gonna ACD a murder defendant, right? Because of immigration consequences. But if you have a client, as I do oftentimes, charged with a first-time DV case or DWI, not that those are charges that carry with them immigration consequences necessarily, but you will have a prosecutor meet you halfway in light of that, for sure.
So what's the difference, for example, if you're a citizen, you're charged first time versus you're an immigrant, you're charged first time, like in terms of strategy when you're trying to deal with the prosecutor? Do you go to the prosecutor and say, hey, my client's an immigrant, so give him a lesser sentence?
Well, when you say immigrant, you mean somebody who's a non-citizen.
Right, someone who's a non-citizen.
Yeah, if you have a client who's a non-citizen, then you obviously look out for that and you talk to the prosecutor about that. And you try to fashion some sort of disposition, assuming the client wants it, that will account for that.
But is that a strategic advantage or a negotiation advantage if the person is a non-citizen? And for getting a better deal in terms of conviction, because it logically, the heavier the conviction, the more immigration consequences there would be, right? So,
but a plea is also a conviction, right? It's just a matter of figuring out. And again, I will usually refer my clients to an immigration lawyer for this because I don't do this. The idea is to figure out a plea that will account for immigration. And do you bring that up to the prosecutor? Yes, of course, because it's important. Maybe the most important thing.
Okay, well, I mean, plea bargaining aside, are there cases where you've had represented immigrants and they've wanted to go to trial because they couldn't take a plea?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That'll happen from time to time. And then you're really left with very few options, right? And again, it depends on how strong the case is and how strong the evidence is. But if you got to try it, you got to try it.
Right. But these immigrant clients would want to protect their immigration status over, going to jail, for example, because leaving the country is far worse than just staying in the country locked up for a while. So.
Well, if you're acquitted, then that's the end of the ball game, right? You're clear on all counts in terms of immigration, jail, and otherwise. And if you're convicted, you're not. But if the prosecutor is not giving you a plea that's counting for certain things, then you have no choice, right? In many of my cases, you can't take a plea because the plea will be problematic for immigration purposes. So you push it, and you see what happens.
Right. I mean, did they ever come back to you and say, even though I was an immigrant, I should have taken the plea?
I've never had a 440 made against me. I've never had a 2255 made against me, so I'll wear those as badges of honor. Now, I've done a whole ton of them. Never had them done against me.
Okay, I see. All right. Well, I mean, is there any specific services your firm offers to immigrants that
No, well, I'll say that my firm is sensitive to that issue. And, some firms aren't and some are. My firm is incredibly sensitive to that issue because I deal with it every day. And I can usually figure out how to get somebody out of a pickle if that pickle involves negative immigration consequences, more often than not. And so that's what I offer as it relates to immigrant-specific services.
Okay, so basically your experience in dealing with immigrants and your network that you can potentially refer them to.
And I'm an immigrant myself, so I'm aware of these issues, right? Close to home.
Right. And of course, your good relationship with the prosecution, because why would they want to deal with someone who's never been before them? So.
Well, yeah, I try to maintain good relationships with everybody, and that typically is helpful in my experience.
I see. All right. Well, we're almost at the end of our show. So, do you have any resources you would like to give to our clients, or any referrals you would give in terms of a subsequent attorney that could potentially appear on this show that they would have benefit to listen to?
Well, there are a few lawyers I work with. I'd have to look through my Rolodex, so to speak. It's not a real Rolodex. But yeah, I mean, there are a whole lot of great lawyers out there that do these kinds of things. You're one of them. And, we'll help people. We continue to help people.
Great. Well, so that concludes our show. Thank you, Dimitry, for appearing. And if you have a chance, check out his podcast, The Fight Lawyer. And I'm sure he's going to be branching off into far more better journeys and adventures in terms of the podcast world as well. So make sure you check out our podcast on Apple Podcasts and all streaming platforms. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my friend. Take care.
You've been listening to Lawyers for Immigrants with your host, Yifei He. You can find prior episodes on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and at www.yifeihelaw.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing this show with others.